Hello, and welcome to A Whittle Early the Long Patrol. And I have to admit, picking this for the 29th of December, well, I just thought it'd be fun. Honestly, I thought it'd be fun. Let's see. So, the concept, as given us before, was the Frank Whittle is given consistent funding by Britain to develop jet engines from 1928. This is an alternate history. And as always with alternate histories when I do them on my channel, I have to... it's following a line of logic. It's not going ad infinitum, because frankly you can't predict too far, and I try and keep it as close to history as possible. I try and find a realistic historical reason for them to have gone the alternate route. Now, honestly, this was a disturbingly easy one to find an alternate route. It really was. It's one of those ones where I looked at it and went, frigate, this could have happened very quickly and very easily. Because if you look at the problems that happen with the development of jet engines in the UK and the politics it falls foul of, and especially the engineering politics it falls afoul of, it's actually quite easy to circumvent that if you go the route that was viable. The other route that was viable. The fact they didn't, to me, shows how tribal in many ways certain sections of Britain's defence organisations had got. They didn't even think about going to the wider structure of the forces. They were concentrating on their own branch and their own branch only. And whilst you can understand that from the point of view of having connections, they did actually have connections in other branches. The thing about the jet engine is that if you combine the work which was being done by Parsons and various other turbine companies to try and make the more efficient turbine, with the work being done by Whittle, the jet engines, you realise very quickly that there is a reason why post-World War II Britain is very quickly able to start going down the development of gas turbines route. And if it hadn't been for governments being very strange about defence funding in the 1950s, very, very strange, Britain would probably have fielded them very, very quickly on a large proportion of the fleet. In fact, there is part of me which wonders if even the Daring class destroyers, which of course are, pardon my Travels by Daring book, shameless book plug, not just for Christmas, it's also a good New Year read. If you haven't got it, it's a cracking read. And I'm not saying this because it's getting very close to January and it's getting very close to a tax bill coming in. It's a cracking good read. Hopefully my tax bill will not be a cracking good read. Hopefully it'll be a very short read. Just very, very short. And hopefully very, very small. Cross fingers. Anyway. So, the concept and the question to be asked was, Whittle's given consistent funding by Britain to develop jet engines from 1928. And this is an interesting point, 1928. It changes things. And there's a reason it changes things, because traditionally and historically he's turned down in 1929. And he's turned down by the Air Ministry on the advice of Alan Arnold Griffith. Now, Griffith is an absolutely exceptional engineer in his own right. But he has a different methodology he's using to try and create something like a jet engine. And therefore he fundamentally disagrees with Whittle's approach. And I wouldn't like to say he over-eggs the custard, but he's very gleeful to find a single, actually quite small when you look into it, mathematical error. And decides that basically declares to the Air Ministry that destroys it entirely and it's completely wrong because of that. Very strong terms. Now, it's understandable for the Air Ministry to go to him, because he is the only other person the Air Ministry has in their tribe who are looking at it. Looking at jet engines. But hang on. Didn't I mention earlier something called a gas turbine, which uses similar principles and technologies that are developed between the two to develop it? Yes, I did. Which means there's other people working on it. Those people connect with the Admiralty. And this is the really interesting thing. Because if Whittle had also gone to the Admiralty would have definitely gone with it. Honestly, the Admiralty is so obsessed with trying to get the most energy-dense power plant they can. They will invest in anything. Why? Because if they can cut down the weight of engines, they have given themselves a huge advantage in the naval treaty system. Engines are the single most heavy thing that goes into ships. Once you go through them, you've got the boilers, you've got the steam turbines, you've got all the shafts, all the machinery, all the piping, all the ballasting to support it, all the systems which have to be put in to support it, and then you've got all the crew which have to be accommodated to support it, and all the crew to support those crew, and all their accommodations. Engines are massively intensive, and anything which can reduce that, anything which can make that easier, when you've got Washington and eventually London naval treaties limiting your overall your individual unit tonnage and your overall ship's tonnage, well, it's heaven sent. It's wonderful. And the reality is this as well. People often say, well, where would the Navy get the money for this? The Navy's investing a huge amount of money in engines as it is. Okay? So is the Air Ministry. They're investing a huge amount of money in engines. Please note, there are several projects which they're investing in which go nowhere. Go absolutely nowhere. Quite a lot of the stuff which the Royal Navy is investing in, which would underpin future gas turbine work, can't go anywhere, I would argue, because it's not hooked up with the jet work of Whittle. And I'd argue that in many ways, a lot of Whittle's work can't go to places it needs to go, because the fine quality understanding of metallurgy, the really fine quality metallurgy understanding and understanding of those materials are not in the aerospace sector at this point. Before people start jumping down my throat and going, oh, no, these are fine engineers. They are, but we're talking about metallurgical science. And that is a major system, a major facility to set up. And if you look at the metallurgical science facilities available to the aero industry in the UK in the 1930s, they are small and nascent. They're good, they've got great people in them, but they are small and nascent. If you look at the ones who are supporting the naval armour industry, the naval gun industry, the naval turbine industry, ship's turbines and ship's engines, those are some massive facilities. Really high grade, really well funded, long established facilities with mounds of research. And the thing is, you won't get access to those if the Admiralty don't give you permission. It's basic security. So, combining those two together, combining that stuff together to produce a project which would be advantageous to jet engines, because frankly, a lot of the problems, when you start looking at the solutions they find for jet engines, and you sit there and go, hang on, I've read that solution. The solutions start cropping up very quickly in World War II once you get to a joint research establishment. It's amazing, once you have a joint research establishment that puts it up, especially post the INSCIP award to the Fleet Air Arm to the Navy. So the Navy has its own aerial research team interfacing with companies, and they're working directly with the RAF researchers instead of working through the. Because what had been going is everything between the RAF teams had gone through their Air Ministry, then to the Admiralty, then to the relevant Admiralty teams. The moment you have the Navy having its own team and the RAF having its own team, and they start talking to each other, amazingly the information without having to go through those layers of politics. Because what always happened was the Navy personnel would send their question up to the Admiralty. The Admiralty would then put it in Admiralty language, send the question to the Air Ministry. Air Ministry would then change it into air-minded language, which would then go down to the Air Force, down to sort of the personnel. Then it would go back and be translated back. And so you have this almost, for want of a better phrase, Chinese whispers scenario going on. And it's a surprise that anyone got any right answers, okay? With it, that's the thing is, it's neither me saying one thing bad about one service or one thing bad about the other service. It's just saying that, frankly, in that scenario, surprisingly, anything actually managed to work. So again, we get back to it. In this scenario, if Whittle had gone to his friends who had been connected with the Fleet Air Arm, and who therefore had naval contacts, and had discussed things with them, I am absolutely 100% certain the Royal Navy gets involved. Because the people the Royal Navy would send it to would probably be Parsons. Maybe John Brown, but probably Parsons. The companies. Not an individual. Companies. And that's the other difference. The Air Ministry literally sends it to Alan Arnold Griffith because he's an individual. Well, if you send it to an individual, you get their individual opinion. And they can be great, but you're now depending entirely on their perspective and their biases. Whereas you send it to a company, especially a company which has a large research team, they're going to review it differently. So if the Royal Navy had sent these ideas and calculations through to John Brown and Parsons, well, I can only base it on the experience of having seen how they reacted to other information when they received it from other people, and it had to pass on other ways. Even if they found a couple of calculation errors, if they go through it and think, broadly speaking, this is actually a good idea and we can pursue this, they would go through and pursue it. And they would get person in contact. And the standard thing was to invite the person to come be a consultant with them and work with them. And of course, this would be happening before the 1930s, where Whittle gets really treated like absolute. So he's still in a great, positive framework. And again, if you consider how the Royal Navy had worked with Parsons, etc., they're used to managing strong, interesting characters and finding a way to get them to work within the system. So I think, especially considering the Third Sea Lord at the time, in 1928, Admiral Blackhouse, I have no doubt that if this had been presented to him, the Royal Navy would have got involved. And if the Admiralty get involved, I do not see the Air Ministry not getting involved as well. Mainly from the point of view of, we might not want to play with that toy, but if you're going to play with it, we sure want to play with it as well. In which case, there could be a little try and be a fight over it, but I think what you'd have is, you'd have a case of, oh, we'll jointly fund this project, we'll jointly fund this work, but we'll sort of take leads on it, in that the Air Ministry will take lead on the jet engine portion of it, and the Navy will take lead on the gas turbine portion of it. I can see it being a whole sort of argument and fighting, but there is actually some advantages if it works out, because it might provide a template that eventually gets radar adopted between both the Navy and the Air Force earlier, and shared between the two, instead of being almost a separate development program. There is sort of lots of advantages if it does work. And I think it would work, because I think, especially initially, a lot of the money would probably come from the Admiralty in terms of trying to get gas turbines through. And I think then they would find the metallurgy and the work on things like compressors, etc., would filter back into the jet design system, and I think that would push it through. So what's new in this timeline? What changes? What is the really, really big change? Well, it's not going to be the same as historically, because historically it takes 2 years of war to rapidly get the engines working. And first flight with Gloucester E-28 for numbers of 15th of May 1941. But that's, of course, after 11 years of refinement development by the Jet Power Company, headed by Whittle, given pretty much no funding and no encouragement and no support, and almost going bankrupt on several occasions. So then you have to come with an idea of what a realistic timeline would look like in reality. And again, those 11 years aren't that helpful because, as said, they nearly go bankrupt. They have trouble securing testing sites, and the Air Ministry was at certain points either actively not helping them, we are not helping you, and we are being very active about not helping you by making sure everyone else is going to the front of the queue instead of you, to actively ignoring them. So there's going to be a difference. So, okay. However, conversely, we're bringing in the metallurgy and the research and development stuff of people like Parsons, like John Brown, like Vickers. And that means you have a lot more of an industrial base behind you. You have... It's one of the things that is kind of interesting in the interwar years. Because of the lack of orders and demands, it slowly goes down the supply... up the supply chain of the various things to reducing the capacity of Britain to produce the stuff, which then has to be built up in the late 1930s to try and deal with World War II demands, versus their capability of producing stuff from World War One. One of the least affected areas is research and development. It's still affected. Okay, please don't get me wrong, I'm not saying. But one of the least effective is the research and development teams. And that's useful. And here, this scenario takes advantage of that. So, 5 years to get to a flying aircraft, I don't think it's impossible. And I think you're going to get a flying aircraft before you get it fitted to a ship, even with the involvement of people in the ships. Principally because Whittle's going to be keen on it, but also because the moment you get past compressor size and you get to the point at which it's actually obviously capable, there are going to be a fair number of people who are going to be really interested in the idea of this. That means first flight in 1933, 1934. Probably would have been a monoplane design. I'm going to say that. Probably would have been a monoplane design and might not have looked too dissimilar to this lovely Gloucester. I don't think it would have looked too dissimilar. I'm tempted to say, due to their Schneider cut work, etc., it could have been Supermarine. Mainly because Supermarine are a very, very proficient single, small run aircraft builder. And they're who the Navy trust implicitly. Because remember, the Navy get their Walrus and various other things from Supermarine. Supermarine are an organisation the Navy trusts instinctually. The other option is Vickers, who again the Navy has a good relationship with. And the reason I'm saying the Navy has a good relationship with these and why that matters is because they're going to want to make sure the Air Force doesn't cut them out. And so they're going to want to make sure it go. And the thing is, if they're providing a large chunk of the money, they're going to get a bit of a say. And the Air Force isn't going to be too bold if it goes to Submarine either, because they know how good they are because of the Schneider Trophy. And I think they probably trust them more than Vickers, because the Air Force is always vaguely, how do I put this politely, vaguely mistrusting of Vickers. And you could argue they could be quite right, because the Air Ministry specifically told Vickers that they were not doing any development of a dive bomber site. And yet, somehow, when the Royal Navy got the skewer and got permission to develop it, Vickers had a dive bombing site available and ready to go. Just amazing. Of course, they'd entirely developed, entirely privately funded, despite the Air Ministry saying repeatedly they didn't want one, and they weren't to develop it and weren't to waste time on it. And the only service one saying they wanted one was the Navy, which didn't have control of the fleet air on time. I'm just gonna suggest that maybe, the service which buys whole battleships and cruisers from and runs the destroyers from a company, along with Shell's buy it a million, might have a little bit more pull on it than the service which likes to buy batches of 20 or 30 aircraft. At this time, considering the price of the aircraft. I'm not sure, but I also have seen some of the checks going backwards and forwards and the amount of monies going backwards and forwards between the Admiralty and Vickers, and frankly, I wouldn't be surprised if they're bought and paid for. Now, if we consider historically, the first vessel to have a gas turbine, as Marinette's development leads to, was 1947. 6 years of being not prioritised wartime development, because, let's be honest, during wartime, the Admiralty didn't want to rapidly implement a new engine system. They didn't want the pressure. They'd rather up the power by having more of what they already had ready and understood, than add in something new, which would require training an entire new batch of people, taking experienced people out of service to train them up, and it just... The problems of force multiplication in wartime were considered viable for implementing of anything like that. But again, we're talking about the early 1930s. Now, if the Admiralty get involved, I would say, especially with Henderson becoming Third Sea Lord in 1933, I'd say in 1934-35 you'd have a motor torpedo boat. Probably a couple of them. Built and testing it. It's cheap, cheerful, very limited stuff you need to put onto public declaration under the treaties about motor torpedo boats. They just have to be within the weight limit, and frankly, everyone ignores them, and they're supposed to go fast, so no one's going to take any notice of the engines too much. And you can do the testing. Now, the Tribal class destroyers are ordered in 1936. I would say destroyers are more likely to be a test bed for it than battleships or cruisers. Again, it makes sense, and again, you're saving weight because, I'll get into this, steam turbines versus gas turbines. You soon realise the gas turbine saves you a lot of weight and gives you a lot of power. But it then will have a ripple-on effect, because if it works for the tribals, and it's designed to be working for them, and it's working for the motor torpedo boats, and they're testing more, you then have the King George V class and the Illustrious class. Now, I don't want to have to wait the whole way through the video to get into the whole steam catapult scenario, but at this point, the steam catapults aren't in use. The catapults being used at this point are hydraulic. And they would be hydraulic the whole way through World War II. So we don't have to worry about that. Later on might lead to steam turbines being steam boilers being fitted to carriers, but we'll leave that to one side. For the Illustrious class, that just means they have an excellent power to weight ratio and they have more weight to do things with. And this is really important once we go into the treaties, because I can see this having a big impact in the treaties. In that, in the 1930 London Treaty, the Royal Navy would be happy to sign up to treaty tonnage limits, because let's be honest, if you're developing a system which can eventually give you let's say 3 times the horsepower per ton once you work out the aggregate of all the things involved. And I'm not just talking, therefore, about replacing steam turbines and boilers with gas turbines. No. You're also only need personnel to run the gas turbine. You don't need personnel to run a steam boiler and a steam turbine, which are 2 groups of people, which actually are both large groups of people then you need to run a gas turbine. Run and maintain it. You need more for either of those options than you do for that. And so that's a whole group of people. You have less. Now, yes, I know overall numbers for damage control then available for damage control go down, but maybe you have to include more people as specific damage control specialists. You work these things out. You also have more a case of free tonnage in terms of what you have to protect, because gas turbines take up a lot less space than steam turbines and steam boilers, especially when you're talking about uptakes and space for funnels and the space inside the hull and the width and the space inside the hull, which allow you to do increased subdivision, which allow you to make it your ship more secure. You also don't have to store as much water and protect the water, but remember also you don't have the water for armor. You could use fuel instead. There's all sorts of options. But the big thing is, you could be talking about a difference of... Well, let's put it this way. In a 10,000-ton ship, let's say you're putting in steam turbines, you could be, in aggregate, talking about 1,500 tons of commitments to get that power out of them. For a gas turbine system, it could be 500 tons of 500 tons. And that's 1,000 tons more to play with to do something else with it. That's armor. That's subdivision. That's all sorts of things you can do. And yes, those are rough stats. But once you start working into all the tubing you need for the water, for steam turbines, or for the boilers, all the tubing you need for the steam between the boilers and the turbines, and all the weight of the boilers, and all the weight and the crew and the systems which need to support those things, you start to realise that there really is a lot of commitment. And this is before we get into the whole debate as to whether or not you're going electric and a sort of using the turbine is the most efficient way to generate constant turning and using gearing to change how much energy it's developing, or if you're using gears to direct gears from the shaft, gears directly from the turbines to the shaft to power the shafts, and combining in turbines. I myself have the suspicion is that's what you probably end up doing, because my suspicion is you'd be talking. The first generation, probably each turbine would be capable of generating roughly 12 to 15,000 shaft horsepower. And I think they'd be pairing them up. Now, I do think the interesting thing is when you get into start looking at other nations, what they would do. This is, of course, the American delegation to the London Naval Treaty, and I have a feeling America would do frigating nothing. Please note, I have a reason for this. Okay? There were actual senators who actually declared their opposition to converting the fleet to an entirely turbine fleet, based on the fact that it would have a deleterious effect on the breadth of US maritime industry and infrastructure. I.e., the triple expansion engines were built in their districts. Honestly, the US Navy only gets a fully turbine fleet, I swear, because certain people die. Even then, it takes them a long time to get a fully turbine fleet. So, a new piece of technology coming in, which they don't have connections to, that will take a while to filter in. I think it would probably wait till after the British had ordered a battleship class of it, at which point they would probably go for it. So, to my mind, that means if the British order the King George V's with gas turbines, then potentially the Hours. Potentially the Hours are gas turbine powered. And that would be an interesting thing to see how the Americans jumped into that. Your big impact is going to, of course, be Germany and Italy. In Germany, they might well take this investment and growth, especially once they see the first jet aircraft appear in 33, 34, and, after Hitler's rise to power in 35, I wouldn't be surprised if jets become the new priority. Now, interesting enough, this is going to cause trouble, because time taken to develop these things, and it is going to take time, especially when you consider the realities of their infrastructure, the realities of their research infrastructure, and their maritime infrastructure base. Are they capable of doing it rapidly and keeping Scharnhorst and Gneisenau on time? No. I wouldn't say they are. So either Scharnhorst and Gneisenau get built to schedule with the systems as is, or they get delayed, which will have consequential ongoing delays for what comes after them, which could have a whole massive ripple effect for German infrastructure and maritime industry, because if you delay the building of the ships because you're waiting for the new technology to be available, might you build something else in that meantime? You might, but you also might not. And let's be honest, German industries often finds itself wrecked from being able to produce the good by seeking the perfect. And if the perfect is now a jet-powered or gas turbine-powered ship, you might not see anything really being built till they have those available, which could put all that construction program back years. I mean, even with the British having it in service and having it therefore probably quite visible in some regards, that you can get some information about it no matter how hard the British try to keep it secret. Honestly, it could go either way. And if it does go the way of them delaying their construction, delaying their building, that could even delay excuse me, the beginning of World War II, because they won't be prepared. They won't be able to do anything. Or alternatively, they start it on schedule, and they're in even worse shape than they were historically. They might not even have Scharnhorst and Gneisenau in service, or their equivalents in service. Let alone Bismarck and Tirpitz waiting to be completed. That's an actual real possibility. So, and you don't think about it, they don't have to be delayed by that long. Delay them a year, and that happens. Delay them the couple of 2-3 years you probably need to develop this sort of system. That's going to happen. And then, well, if the Germans haven't done their surface ship build-up, they haven't got their Hipper class, if they haven't got their Scharnhorst, etc., Gneisenau, Norway, all sorts of things of World War II become very different. This is, again, though, going off the topic. This is why when I say with alternate history, I try and keep as close to historical events as possible. But this is an actual confluence. Italy, Japan, well, they both suffer from the same thing of overcommitment and under-resourced. Japan has the capacity to develop gas turbines. Please, don't get me wrong, they have the capacity. Just with all the work they're doing on other things, I think their research establishments would be overloaded. I don't know if they have the space or anything. If they pick to do gas turbines, they're going to have to not do something else. And the trouble is, by the time this becomes dominant and visible and really hits the world stage, and it's going to really hit the world stage when that jet aircraft has its first flight and gets publicised, and it will be publicised. It won't be its first flight that gets publicised, it'll be its first flight which gets publicised. You know, you do a few practice flights, take it off, fly it around, yeah, it works. Then you go and have all the press over and all the ambassadors over, and you go, this is the first flight of our new aircraft that we know flies. I hope that doesn't upset anyone. I do realise there are some people who honestly believe those highly publicised first flights are the real first flights. But this is not even my conspiracy theory. This is just my personal fundamental belief. You do not invite press and ambassadors to watch you flop. You check it out first. You check it out heavily first. I mean, even if you're maybe not taking it up in midair, into the air, you taxi along the runway, you warm up the engines, you test everything else out before it takes off, so you know it takes off. But no, I honestly think, strangely enough, the British pursuing this in this time period, especially in the 1930s, doesn't change wider history that much, mainly because of the time it would take to react. And please note, the Germans do have good ideas. Historically, they do actually have the ideas at roughly the same time as Whittle. And they have all their problems and their political issues they have in the 1930s and the rise, of course, of fascism, Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party. And then they get into it, and then they push really hard and really fast for it. And they do get the first jet aircraft in the air, and they get the first jet fighter, etc. The British respond fairly quickly, but they get the first of these things. And that's down to their efforts and concentration. But the thing is, we're starting off with the concentration beginning in Britain in 1928, and the Germans can't do it in 1928. They can't match it. They can't really match the effort until 1935, 36, and that's going to be after the British have their first flight, their first motor torpedo boat, their first aircraft on order, and probably their first service aircraft well on the line to being developed. Well on the line to being developed. So I'm going to start off with the naval differences, and there's a reason for that. Because if we consider the timeline, I've already pointed out that the Royal Navy, the ships coming in, they're not going to change much. The Royal Navy still has the emphasis, and if you consider the timeline of construction of ships, that is not going to change that much. Those ships are still going to be 6-inch cruisers. Those ships are still going to be 14-inch battleships. I wish they wouldn't be, but they are going to be, because it's still going to be Chatfield as First Sea Lord, so it's still going to get the 14-inch gun jammed through. You might see a difference. The only difference I could see in terms of actual ship operations could be the illustrious class, because I do know that the Royal Navy would have liked the hangar to be in higher and would have liked more aircraft. They were sacrificing all those things for the armour, because within the wastelands they only had so much weight they could use to get the 6 carriers under the cumulative weight allowance they're allowed under the treaty. If you are reducing the weight and sort of the stand displacement by 1,000, 1,500 tons of engines and engine systems, I could see you using that to make the ship a little bit longer, a little bit making because the engines will take up less height. You could actually, the ship would stay the same height, but the hangar could get higher. If that makes sense. And you could, with a little bit of length, a little bit more space, you could end up accommodating more aircraft. I don't know if they go to deck edge lift route. That was the other thing considered to accommodate more aircraft. I don't want to add that in purely for the point of view as much as I think they should have gone that route. They didn't historically. So that would be me adding in my personal view. They were still reeling over the North Sea, nicking so many aircraft from their decks in certain periods in the interwar years. North Sea, North Atlantic, South Atlantic, all like to try and take aircraft off the decks. That had a left legacy for the Royal Navy when it came to deck parking and when it came to deck edge lifts. That's a concept. There's something about it. We've lost more aircraft this year through the sea than through accidents or enemy action. Oh, yeah. So, I don't think the ships change. But if we consider aircraft, in the 1920s and 30s, the standard cycle generation for an aircraft was 3 years. So if you have your first flight in 1933-34, you'd have your first in-service aircraft probably, if you consider again what the next generation was due in, next generation was due in 36, 37. Next generation after that was 39, 40. So you wouldn't be talking about your first generation of aircraft, you'd be talking about 2 generations of aircraft. And they're going to build on each other. So The first generation is going to come in, is going to build on the experience, and they're going to have some years of operating out before they order the second generation of aircraft, which are going to be built on based on the experience of building the first generation, the knowledge, understanding gained, the operational gain of it, and all the testing that's been done in the meantime. So I cannot predict what that second generation of aircraft are going to look like. I'll give you some rough ideas and I'll talk that through, but it's far easier for me to talk about naval differences because, honestly, they're kind of easy for me to work out. Boats, motor torpedo boats. Well, that's an easy one. The trouble for the Royal Navy was they wanted to build theirs tougher than the Germans built theirs. The Germans built theirs for speed, for elegance. The British built theirs for maneuverability and, honestly, ruggedness and ability to carry weaponry. Well, if you've got gas turbines, you can give them enough power that you can crank them out at very high speed. They can go incredibly fast. Well, you might even go further and fit in with jets and just go, let's see how fast we can make these things go. There are options, but the honest response is, in the Royal Navy's terms, these are going to be fast. There's also going to be the fact that with them testing out gas turbines on them, they're probably going to start producing some in the early 1934, 35, and they might well keep producing a flotilla each year, which means you might have far more of a design development prior to World War II, and you might have far more in service. One interesting thing is I'm still fairly certain the company which is going to take the lead of it is going to be Fairmile. I am certain Fairmile is going to be getting the lead because they are trusted by the Royal Navy to produce their boats, and they are basically specialised in it. So Fairmile would probably get the lead, and who knows what would happen, but we're talking dog boats with speeds higher than Schnell boats. That's not a good scenario for anyone else to fight them. Destroyers, travel class onwards. Interesting thing again. So, in 1936, roughly when ordnance, they are looking at the first generation of dual-purpose 4.7-inch turret. And it's what eventually gets developed and put aboard the L class. Now, the trouble is, at this point, it's considered too heavy. So they go with mounts, which are similar to what these 4-inch guns are in here, but not the same. They're 4.7-inch mounts. But here's the interesting thing. With the weight differential, you wouldn't have needed to do any modifications, and you could have fitted 4 of those turrets in their original form. And in their original form, they were actually quite good. What's interesting is they put them on a weight loss diet, the design. It goes down roughly 20%, goes up 10% again because they found they've managed to muck it up. Gets fitted to the L class in that form, and that form is never really as good as it could have been. So, under this scenario, you could have actually gone with the original. And that gives you an interesting change from history onwards, because if those become the standard gun fitting, well, those guns were dual purpose, able to do the angles. And if you've got a dual purpose 4.7-inch gun, 4.750, you've got a very good gun. Yes, it fires a slightly heavier shell, has pretty much the same rate of fire. If it's able to do the high angle fire as well and cover and defend against aircraft coming in, you're not going to have the weakness you have of destroyers early in the war, where because of the exercises, etc., it's considered good. It was good enough to have low angle guns because everyone was targeting the carriers and the capital ships. You would have an actual true dual purpose weapon. So that's going to mean that you're going to be less affected by air attacks. Also could be slightly faster. And the point, once we get into the tribal class especially, is their power comes from 3 Admiralty drum boilers, driving 2 geared steam turbines, supplying 2 shafts. And they're only supplying with 44,000 shaft horsepower. Now, if you have 4 11,000 shaft horsepower producing gas turbines, Well, if you consider, even if you've got gearing to connect them between the two, connect them into the two shafts, and you've got two turbines per shaft, it was geared steam turbines, so the gearing is probably going to be not much different in weighting. So you've got the lost steam turbines, you've lost the Admiralty drum boilers. That's a lot of weight saved. As said, the guns are the first thing, but there's also the quite real possibility you could be talking about something slightly more than 11,000 shaft horsepower. I would reckon it'd be between 11 and 15,000 shaft horsepower, and so theoretically you could have both shafts hooked onto a combined gearbox which is supplied by 3 turbines, but you probably wouldn't do that. If you go with a 4 scenario, 4 turbines, each 15,000 shaft horsepower, you can go up to 60,000 shaft horsepower. That's going to change things. That's going to change your speed, your capabilities. That's going to change your capabilities dramatically. And those four turbines are not going to take up as much weight or as much crew. Won't let you probably get in an extra set of torpedo launchers. Might let you get the quintuple launcher rather than the quadruple. Might let you get a quintuple rather than the quadruple. But it will change quite a few things. For starters, you probably wouldn't need to have 2 stacks, not a 2 funnel arrangement. And that's going to have an effect on things. You're going to not need as many crew. You can probably have more subdivision. Individual spaces will be smaller. And if you consider you have boiler rooms, turbine rooms, etc., all those things in that ship, you would probably divide it up far more, which is going to give you more survivability. That can be very useful. And that's going to have an impact on all subsequent destroyers as well. All subsequent destroyers are going to be affected by that. And I'd also add in, of course, you have the scenario that you can shut down fully in harbour and still cycle up your gas turbines and go very quickly. A lot of the issues of getting ships to sea quickly ends with gas turbines versus steam plants. And that's going to have an impact on your operations. And then, of course, we have cruisers. Cruisers are probably the more interesting area to start with, because with destroyers it's all so tight. But if we consider for the Edinburgh class, they had 82,500 shaft horsepower. That's what they required to achieve their 32.25 knots, or their range of 5,300 nautical miles at 13 knots. Now again, if you go with the 11,000 shaft horsepower option as your option, if you had 4 of those on your tribals to give you 44,000 shaft horsepower, then you go for 8 on your Edinburgh. What are they replacing? Well, they're replacing 4 geared steam turbines and 4 Admiralty free drum boilers. Okay, that's going to be a weight saving. That is going to be saving weight. Because those are, again, cruiser scale boilers. There is a difference between the size of boilers. They're all called free drum boilers because they're all that type in shape and form. But a destroyer free drum boiler is far smaller than a cruiser or a capital ship one. So, What happens if they're 15,000 shaft horsepower units? Well, you probably still go for 8 to replace it. But that gives you 120,000 shaft horsepower rather than 88,000 shaft horsepower. So instead of you having 5,500 shaft horsepower more, you have 37,500 shaft horsepower more. And that's probably going to take your top speed up to 35 something knots. Which is not bad. Let's be honest, that's going to make you happy. There's also the point at which the cruising speed and how this is going to be affected, because let's be honest, for cruising, what might you do? You might, on cruising speed, if you've got gearing, just turn on 4 turbines. You don't need, you can turn on the gears and all the system, but you can just have 4 turbines running. Cut your fuel consumption by 50% immediately, and you've got half your shaft horsepower. That could be 60,000 shaft horsepower. And you also have to consider that gas turbines tend to be a lot more fuel efficient than steam boilers and steam turbines, where you lose energy in heating the outside space, as well as heating the water to get it to steam, and you lose energy in conversions of the water to steam and the steam to power. All these things are going to lose you energy. The more powerful and the higher pressure you get the steam to, the more efficient it gets. But a gas turbine is a lot more efficient. And it's a lot lighter. And that means you can have more armour, more subdivision, more survivability. And then, well, that's going to affect HMS Edinburgh and Belfast most of all. They are the last 2 of the town class. Most likely to be mucked around with. They're also the biggest of the 3 types of town class. I don't think this gets them the quad 6-inch turrets within their tonnage. But I think it does add something even more to those ships being very, very nasty pieces of work for anyone to try and fight. Dido class. As much as I'd love to wish them out of existence, they are built. And again, if we consider their power requirements, it's 62,000 shaft horsepower, 4 Admiralty-free drum boilers, 4 steam turbines. So if you have 15,000 shaft horsepower gas turbines going around, you might just fit 4 of them. Call it a day, 1 for each shaft. That's going to save you a lot of weight. If you are using 11,000 shaft horsepower ones, you might fit 8 of them. Give you a boost of 88,000 shaft horsepower, which 16,000 more shaft horsepower, again, that's possibly going to get you up to 35, 36 knots. From 32.25 knots, which is your speed. And what does increased speed mean? And a higher top speed, a more efficient cruising speed. What do these things really mean? These mean a lot more capable operations, but also they mean that the Royal Navy has more flexibility in terms of operation. If you've got everything being faster, if your destroyers, your cruisers are all faster, then they can maneuver across distances faster. You can cut down the time it takes to move from A to B. If you've got the ability to spool up and send your ships to sea as quickly as you can with a gas turbine, that means you can react to events far more quickly. It also means you've got more time to wait to load up things. This all has an impact. The Fiji or Crown Colony class. Always a lovely class, and again, their power is 72,500 shaft horsepower. Thanks to 4 geared steam turbines and 4 Admiralty-free drum boilers. Notice a theme emerging here. And again, that's 11,000 shaft horsepower turbines. Gas turbines could do it. Or it's 120,000 shaft horsepower.
honestly think if the Dido class, if you are 15,000 shaft horsepower turbines and you're fitting 8 of them too, you're giving them 120,000 shaft horsepower. I think at that point you're probably using the weight to reinforce the hull, because that amount of power going into it, you're gonna be going fast. For the Fiji class, that tonnage might well represent the difference between them actually working as their London Treaty fitting design, or actually being worthy successors of the Town class without major wartime modifications. And then we have the Adil class, the mine laying cruiser, 2,650 tons in standard, roughly 3,415 or 475 tons in full, depending on which group they are. 4 Admiralty free drum water tube boilers supplying 2 Parsons geared steam turbine units driving 2 shafts, for a total of 72,000 shaft horsepower. If they insist with maintaining a 72,000 shaft horsepower and 2 shaft design, you'd probably, your options, if it's, are to try and hook up 4 gas turbines to each shaft if they're at 11,000 shaft horsepower. Probably 3 if they're 15,000 shaft horsepower, and that's slightly more sensible. Or you go with a 3 shaft arrangement, which is what I would personally do, and go with 6 15,000 shaft horsepower in turbines if you've got that ability. Either way, I think that could well be a speed bump. You are talking about 4 big cruiser level boilers supplying 2 specialist turbine units, geared turbine units, to get the maximum oomph out of everything, and 72,000 shaft horsepower to give them a top speed of 38 knots, normally 40 knots at light load. Officially. Knowing the Royal Navy, as I do, in terms of their history and in terms of 1920s, 30s, I have no doubt, and the reason I've picked on the 15,000 shaft horsepower figure is because that sort of fits there. When you're looking at some of the early gas turbines, etc., that's a figure they get to quite quickly and they stay at. It fits with a lot of the metallurgy already available in the sort of the mid 1930s in terms of the metallurgy of turbine design already around there. There's not a lot of development. Anything over 20,000 shaft horsepower requires a lot of development, but over 15,000 is a specialist, whereas up to 15,000, between 11 and 15,000, you can get there quite easy with the metallurgy available at the time. It's there, it's already there. It needs to be brought together, but it's there, if that makes sense. So my suspicion is they go with a 3 shaft 6 15,000 shaft horsepower turbine design, and yes, it becomes a rocket ship. Because in cruising mode, when it's running on 1 turbine per shaft, that's still 45,000 shaft horsepower. Turn on the second turbines. Oh, we're now at 90,000 shaft horsepower. Were you keeping up with us? Oh, goodbye. And when we consider the speed they were already doing with their fuel, with their hull coefficient, I think they could have taken that speed. I think they could have taken that power, and I think they could have had fun with it. And basically, what else do I think changes? I don't. In this way, these end up with the same guns they do. This one might end up with that 4.7-inch dual purpose, because as they were historically, they got the quick firing 4-inch AA guns because they were able to do high angle and low angle, because the 4.7-inch wasn't considered ready. Had the 4.7-inch ready, have it fitted to all the destroyers,
it's going to be ready for them, they'll get it. And then you'll end up with something which is functionally with 6 4.7-inch in free twin turrets and all the other systems they're fitted with, and the ability to carry 156 mines. Functionally a souped up cruiser-sized mine-laying tribal class destroyer. I don't want to fight that. Battleships. Now here is the thing, Warspite comes in too late, so she's not going to get upgraded in this scenario. She won't get upgraded with gas turbines. But Queen Elizabeth, Valiant and Renown all could. They all could. Now, whilst Warspite is too early to get the implementation, unless she is literally implemented, unless they decide to put in them as almost a test bed into her. That's the only scenario Warspite gets gas turbines, I would see, and they almost would have to be putting them into a, as they're sticking them in the motor torpedo boats, so I don't see that happening. But if we consider the fact that the wonderful, the one and only Queen HMS Renown goes in with 112,000 shaft horsepower, 42 water tube boilers, and 2 geared steam turbine sets driving 4 shafts, and comes out in 1939 with 8 boilers, supplying 4 geared steam turbines driving 4 shafts. She goes from having 112,000 shaft horsepower and a top speed of 32 knots to having 120,000 shaft horsepower and a top speed of 31 knots. So, if we consider Queen Elizabeth and Valiant, they also accept they keep them at the same speed, which is originally 24 water tube boilers and 75,000 shaft horsepower, driving 2 steam turbine sets, each driving driving 4 shafts between them. So, I would say this. If you're replacing 24 water tube boilers and 2 steam turbine sets with 8 gas turbines with 15,000 shaft horsepower, you've gone up to 120,000 shaft horsepower. I don't think that gets you to 28 knots from 24 knots. I don't, because it's only an extra, 45,000 shaft horsepower. It might get you to 28 knots for Queen Elizabeth and Valiant. It's possible. I would say with Renown, again, you are replacing 42 water tube boilers and 2 skid steam turbines. You're saving weight when you put in 8 modern boilers and 4 geared steam turbines. And you're getting 120,000 shaft horsepower. Again, if it's 15,000 shaft horsepower ones, it's 8 of them onto the 4 turbines. You've got that. And then you've got a whole lot of weight saved. A whole lot of weight. A whole lot of crew. All sorts of things saved. She has a complement of 1,200 crew. 1,200 out of those HMS Renown. You imagine how many of those crew are to monitor her boilers 24 hours a day and her steam turbines 24 hours a day. She has 8 boilers and 4 geared steam turbines. If you go down to 8 gas turbines, and 15,000 shaft horsepower are not going to be massive, you could probably have them in 4 rooms. And that's if you go with direct drive, geared 2 shaft scenarios. If you go with electric drive, and we haven't discussed this much, but if you go with electric drive, you think about how survivable you can make it. Because you would need any one of those engine rooms to survive to operate and provide power to any one of those shafts. You can stick them on a single ring, on a combined ring that can go around the ship.
power circuit which goes around the ship and allows you to power anything in the ship. You, even with that space, could probably stick in 6 such power rooms. So you could have 150,000 shaft horsepower worth of power developed. And yes, you're going to lose some of the efficiency with it being converted into electricity and then turned into and pumped into the systems. But that's still going to probably be lighter than what they were fitted with, and it's going to be a lot more survivable. And again, you can change where you put it in the ship. It's not going to be necessarily the same big cavernous space stretching up through the hull of the ship. It's going to be a lot smaller space. It's not going to be as wide. If you've got 4 turbines and you've got 6 generation units, you could have a pair of generation units, pair of turbines, pair of generation units, pair of turbines, pair of generation units. So there is no scenario where you lose all your power generation, and no scenario where you lose all your turbines. And they could all be divided off down the centre as well. So you have it divided off, you'd have a thick bulkhead, thick longitudinal bulkhead. You'd have all these things along through the ship. It can make life very, very interesting. And the same goes for the King George V class. Again, the King George V class, they have 120,000 shaft horsepower. That's what they're aiming for. 4 geared steam turbines. 4 shafts supplied by 8 Admiralty free drum boilers. And their top speed is 28 knots. And again, you can go through the motions. And again, if you're talking about taking out all the boilers, you don't need 8 boilers. You don't need 4 geared steam turbines. You could have literally 8 gas turbines. That's going to be a massive reduction in space. Even if you still have it separate like this, you could have it your gas turbines, engines, gas turbines, engines, different shaft, different stack for each set of turbines to deal with the gases going out, the fumes, and the air coming in. You don't have water as armour, but you can do other things. And the other point I would say is this, with gas turbines and the maintenance of gas turbines and their systems, I would say if you go the electric power route, you make the survivability of your ships even more likely. Because the sheer amount of power they could generate, the systems you could plug into them in the post-World War II scenario and keep them around. Now, admittedly, if you go, it's going to open up the DC versus AC debate, and they're probably going to have gone DC, considering it's the early the mid to late 1930s, rather than AC, because they haven't done the testing of Daring class they did historically, where half were produced for AC units and half were produced with DC. To test them out, but it's a potential. It's a potential. And the thing is, the problem with the electric system, as the Americans had found, was the weight of the electric system. Once you add in all the generating costs of the boilers and the steam turbines and generating the electricity and then dispensing the electricity. Well, you still got rid of the steam turbines. Still got rid of the boilers. The gas turbines are a lot lighter than steam turbines. it's fundamentally a possibility, and it's a very survivable option. It's a very advantageous option to push down. And that's before we even get to these. So you might be talking faster battleships and a faster battle line from the Royal Navy. You might well be talking faster ships. They've got more shaft horsepower, they will go faster. And even more survivable than they were historically. Again, if we consider the whole problem with Prince of Wales, etc., in terms of power, if she's got a system where she's got 6 turbines, 6 turbine rooms producing power, and she's got the 4 shafts, and one of the shafts gets damaged, etc., that's going to just go into that room. It's going to be quite easy to subdivide off because it's got no direct linking into other rooms. The tubing goes to that space, and maybe some spaces along the route, but those are going to be a lot smaller. And she's still going to have the power coming in from everything else, which is going to allow her power to all her damage control systems. And that's the advantage of the electrical system. You can you can push the turbine room, the gas turbine rooms where you need them to be, to an extent, to make them survivability and more survivable, and give them the ability to survive. But also, as they're surviving, that means you have far more power for things like pumps, damage control lights. All those systems are far more viable. Aircraft carriers I've also already started to discuss a bit, the Illustrious class. Honestly, the Illustrious class Unicorn I see coming out not too dissimilar as they were, but I wouldn't be surprised if the Illustrious can actually take 48 aircraft rather than 36. Because I think they would use that weight and that tonnage saved, A, to provide more space in the hull for things to bring things down and make the hangar slightly bigger, but B, to extend the length of the vessel. And people might go, well, yeah, what's she going to do about stability in that scenario? Aviation fuel, all sorts of tanks. As I would say with the Illustrious class, very quickly it was found they could take more fuel than they were supposed to be able to take under the treaty system. It just turned out that some of the water ballast tanks, which they had for stability reasons and sort of managing things, could be very quickly turned into fuel storage tanks. It's just they had the same fittings and everything. Just must have been cost saving. So I do not believe that is beyond the wit of the Royal Navy's and the naval constructors. In fact, I think they'll probably be very happy with that. Again, the thing is, these traditionally have free shafts. And traditionally, although I suppose historically is probably the better phrase, they have 6 boilers, 3 steam turbines, 3 shafts, and are supplying with 111,000 shaft horsepower. I think you probably end up going with a 4 shaft arrangement, and I wouldn't be surprised if you ended up with whatever arrangement you put in the King George V's, you put into them. Whether if it's electric power and they've got 6 generation rooms, each of a pair of turbines, that's what they put into these. If you've got 4 turbine rooms, direct drive onto those shafts, that's what they'll end up with. Which does have some interesting things for history in terms of historical damage of Illustrious getting damaged. Because remember, one of her central shaft gets damaged, and basically she spends most of the end of World War II operating on 2 shafts because she hasn't got enough, the shaft's not working, and that drops her down, if we think about it, in terms of shaft horsepower by a third. So it takes her down by roughly 33,000 shaft horsepower. She's able to actually properly communicate into the water, because she hasn't got that extra steam turbine set. That extra steam turbine shaft able to work. Well, if she's got 120,000 shaft horsepower, and she's got 4 shafts, if one of the shafts goes down, it's a drop of still 30,000 shaft horsepower, but she still has 90,000 shaft horsepower, which is slightly better. And again, it's a slight amount increase of speed, but yeah, I think she could deal with it. I would prefer myself they go the electric route,
And considering the routes they went the moment they were able to get off the treaty limits and they weren't doing the war emergency build, and what they did with their ship designs as a result of that, I think if they'd had the spare tonnage, because they hadn't been up against it on the tonnage limitation to get enough ships in a cumulative tonnage limitation. That was always more a problem for the Royal Navy, the cumulative tonnage limitation than the individual tonnage limitation. I think you see these ships being far. I would say my money would be on the electric route, possibly even for the destroyers. The destroyers are the least likely to go that route, but I reckon anything bigger, I could see going the electric drive route. Because of the survivability it brings into their ship designs. With very little extra effort, you can make your ship incredibly more survivable. And that matters to the Royal Navy, because you have to remember the Royal Navy's thinking the whole way through about fighting a war in the Far East, the other side of the world, from its infrastructure and its support basing and ability to actually resupply and repair ships, or fighting in the Mediterranean and North Sea, etc., where it's going to be constantly in range of enemy land bases and land-based aircraft. It's expecting any war scenario it's looking at is expecting to take a lot of damage and have to keep on fighting and maintaining its fleet. So anything it can do which can improve the survivability of its ships, and therefore their likelihood to survive being attacked, and therefore their likelihood to be able to repair and be able to return to the front line, or at least for their crew to be saved and return to the front line, is something the Royal Navy is really prepared to put effort into. But of course, the biggest problem with estimating aircraft numbers, etc., is the size of the aircraft, because that's another reason why carrier air groups shrink in size and number. Because the carrier's built when aircraft are one size, and then the aircraft grow bigger. And this leads us all rather neatly into naval aviation and aviation as a wider thing in this scenario. Now, this is of course Eric Winkle-Brown's first landing on an aircraft carrier, the first time a jet lands on an aircraft carrier. And it's the 3rd of December 1945, and yes, there was a little bit of a race going on. But it's the de Havilland Vampire, a forerunner of the Sea Vampire, but it's a land-based aircraft, and honestly, my strong suspicion is that, especially when it comes to torpedo bombers, the Royal Navy would probably go with turboprop propeller aircraft, i.e., rather than using pure jet, would use jet-powered propellers systems, as they're very efficient, very reliable, and actually quite easy to make. And that would fit the Royal Navy's doctrine for night operations especially. Now, I would see that generation of aircraft probably entering service 1936. And that might well mean that the Swordfish doesn't exist in this timeline, in terms of it had been coming to service in 33 and was kept in service. It was never really sort of replaced in 36. It was an upgraded Swordfish. Instead, I think this would be an adapted unit, a sort of a new aircraft. So that might be interesting, as that might be a monoplane, but they would still be trying to fit it with the whole system the British have for launching torpedoes to make them belly flop, i.e. the tension wire and the extended fin. So it would be interesting. It'd be interesting, and for those who want to know more about tension wire, I've done lots of videos about Swordfish and torpedo dropping, but basically, in quick, if we use this lovely World of Warships torpedo I was given when I went to visit HMS Belfast while they were there, imagine there's some a string or cord here, and to drop a torpedo, make it belly flop, because torpedoes tend to be either nose heavy, because you have all the heavy explosives and dense stuff here, so they tend to do that and hit the bottom. So, okay, right, and you fit fins. Okay, that makes them do that. But they still come in and hit the bottom. You want them to belly flop. So the British came up with the idea of a tension wire. Because no one will look for wires in the water. That's just going to be normal in a port after torpedoes and bombers have been through. And so that added just enough that they went belly flopped. And then the wires disconnected.
And so that's why the Taranto raids, the torpedo bombers, as officially are quite so successful compared for their per aircraft and torpedo dropped, versus the Japanese at Pearl Harbor, because a lot of the Japanese torpedoes end up going into the bomb because they don't have tension wires. The British would want to continue that system on, especially if this has led to a closer cooperation of radar. Then that might also be implemented slightly earlier, and you might have radar coordination of aircraft happening and being developed earlier. The initial systems were based off the systems which have been developed from using spotting aircraft, flying above carriers, using basically binoculars. If you have radar and jet aircraft or turboprop aircraft coming into more likely the second generation turboprop aircraft coming into service in 1939, 1940, you are more likely also having more radar more widely fitted, especially on aircraft carriers. Now that's going to have a consequence for World War II. Might lead to certain ships maybe not being as surprised as they were, and maybe not having the same scenario. There's always the fact that conversely, if you have more radar more widely fitted at the beginning of World War II, especially the types of radar they are, there's the potential that submarine attacks are actually less successful, because the amount of submarines which first spotted their targets by being on the surface, and if you have radar which can do surface search as well as air search, that will spot that. Slightly later coming in, but again a slightly earlier start. Well, it could well have been in service slightly earlier. And then, of course, you have radar which, once it gets good enough, spots things like the periscope above the water. And combine that with ASDIC, and that could make life very interesting for submarines in certain attacks, and also could, of course, allow carriers to avoid surface ships coming after them, even if they're not flying a cap. But either way, my view is that jet aircraft will be coming. I just don't know if the Royal Navy would get them in 1940. I think with the threats to the UK, I think the emphasis will be on jet-powered pure jet, as proper jets and full-on jets, will be on land-based fighter force, who are starting to get funding about 1936. That's about when they start actually getting attention being paid to them. And so I think you really would see probably the second generation 39 entering service 39. It would be jet-powered fighters which would be defending Britain in the Battle of Britain. Would they be going up against jet-powered aircraft from the German side? Ooh, that depends on how efficiently the Germans run their program. And how efficiently and how political it becomes, how politically important it becomes. Because honestly, I have to say the jet program doesn't get a lot of input from certain senior people in Germany. I.e. Goering doesn't play around with it as much because he's not convinced it'll work, so he doesn't think it's going to give him a good status. But if, as head of the Luftwaffe and head of the 5-year plan, the office of the 5-year plan, if he thinks the jet's more important, you can guarantee he'll be all over that, in which case, who knows what happens. So fighters, yeah. I think I wouldn't be surprised if the first generation of fighters do not look too different to the Gloucester Meteor. It's a very simple, very straightforward design. It's something you could certainly have seen made in 1936, in service in 1936. The next generation could be interesting. They could be more vampire-like. They could be more... there's a few other sort of things they could be, but they're going to be a development of them. And that's the important thing to think about. They're going to be improved versions of them. Also, the first generation are unlikely to have radar. But the second generation could have built-in radar. And that could make things really, really interesting. Especially for night operations and night attacks. So it's going to be a cumulative factor. But one of the reasons why I think war might end up being delayed till at least September 1940 in this scenario is because of the factor that Britain will both
have this tech which Germany will desperately want to have itself and master itself, and the time it will delay, way it will delay things implementing that tech, but also because Britain investing and developing new things is going to make Britain look more prepared than it actually is. For probably not any more money, for rearranging money that they were spending on other things anyway, they will buy themselves an extra 12 months of peace to prepare for war. It's still not the 1942 the service has been promised, because they've been promised there was going to be no war at least for 10 years up until 1932 when they stopped the 10-year rule, and certainly it's not going to give them at least the 5 years they'd hoped to get from 1937 when the government really cracks open the funding. But it's an extra 12 months. It's an extra 12 months where if we look at things, the King George V class could probably have, a large number of them could have ended service. So the illustrious class. The Lion class will be that much further along. There'll be all sorts of destroyers in service. Considering the Flower class corvettes are probably ordered at the same time as them, at the same time as they were historically, a huge number of those will be in service. And honestly, if the Germans have been delayed in any of their productions, the only thing that probably wouldn't be delayed is submarines. And if you have to remember, submarines don't really start coming up in numbers till mid to late 1941, 1942. That's when submarine numbers start to surge. And that's after war effort, and war has shown that submarines are value, and after they've lost the destroyers at Narvik and the Graf Spee at the Battle of the River Plate. This is the point. They've lost a lot by the point at which they make that decision to really emphasize the submarine route. If you've got 12 months and surface ships especially have been delayed and they're trying to get the surface ships done and they want to get them out with gas turbines because the British are building theirs with gas turbines and they want them out and they want them to be cool, they want it to be capable, they want to look really modern and ultra advanced and the best in the world and all that stuff. Their submarine program might even be delayed by it all, by the emphasis being put onto the jet program and the jet and gas turbine program. And then we got the nasty little thing here, because this is really in some regards a scaled up meteor, in some regards. Certainly in some of its concepts. And if you consider the bomber emphasis of the Air Ministry in the 1930s, basically the whole way through, the bomber mafia did not capture the Air Force; they captured the Air Ministry. It's often misunderstood, that one. Sometimes when you're making points about how the Air Force doesn't seem to get it, really what you should be referring to is the Air Ministry, because it gets captured by one group who has a passionate, fervent belief that they are right when it comes to national security, and that there is one solution to every single problem, and they are the guardians and prophets of it. In other words, they develop an ideology rather than a strategy. It's always dangerous when people have an ideology rather than a strategy. There's a big difference between those two things. Ideologies do not conceive of being wrong. Strategies have to be tested in every single way as to whether or not they're wrong. So, a good point in the live when we were talking about this was, well, hang on, turboprops. And I think you could end up with turboprop aircraft being developed as bombers, but I think also you could end up with jet bombers. And it's a really interesting thing, whether you get a Mosquito in this scenario, because if you have a really fast, bigger bomber, why do you need a Mosquito? Or do you develop a Mosquito anyway, like aircraft anyway, with really good turboprops? Or do you develop a jet Mosquito? It's all an interesting question, but again, I leave you back to that second generation thing. I fundamentally believe that at least one of the bombers coming into service in that second generation, in that 1940 timeline, is going to be a jet-powered aircraft. Fundamentally believe. And that's going to then have an interesting impact on a lot of problems. A lot of problems. Because if it's fast enough, the German air defense network, unless they have rapidly changed things from how they existed historically, and I mean rapidly changed their emphasis and technological development focus, and not only funded a jet program, which they didn't historically fund, and gas turbine program, which they didn't historically fund, but also funded far more an air defense program that they didn't historically fund in terms of radar development, etc. Air defense radar was something they got round to later on. When they did, it was fairly good stuff, but it was later on in their radar development program. They had other priorities. Well, I could see some very, very nasty strikes being carried out by these aircraft. And again, if you have turboprop long-range bomber aircraft, they could also be very high altitude. The British could be doing their night bombing raids and can never come into range of the German fighters until they develop them to counter them. It could turn into even more of a tech race. You also have the potential of British long-range fighters escorting the bombers. Because again, turboprop is how has the turboprop and jet aircraft, jet fighters developed? How have they evolved? How have they become? What they come about as? It's going to be complicated, and it's going to have an impact. I can't tell you how it's going to have an impact. I have a theory with rapid reaction capability of some very fast jet bombers, especially if war doesn't start till September 1940, and if they've come into service in January, into service in January, early 1940. I could see you having rapid strikes launched against places like Wilhelmshaven, etc. the moment war's declared. And maybe they drop pamphlets, but possibly they drop bombs and other things on things before units are actually really prepared for war. And again, do the Germans have those ships in service? What decisions did they make? Did they build the Scharnhorst and Eisenhower as designed, and then plan it for the next generation? Or do they wait to develop the gas turbines for them, in which case they possibly only get a Scharnhorst and Eisenhower into service later? In which case, I would say if either of them was still, well, how'd I put this, within range of British bombing forces, the British bombing forces would never let them leave within range of the bombing forces while they're being built. If they can bomb them, they will bomb them. Any ships which are on slipways, in dry docks, they are open season. Because, again, to damage them, you have to do so much less. If a ship is up on wood, it's being held in place by huge blocks of wood, waiting for you to flood it and float it out in a dry dock. If you get some bombs into that dry dock and you cause that wood to break, that wood to burn up and disappear, ship goes crack down, all sorts of things, problems. You could break its back. Either way, you're going to do enough damage. It's going to be delayed for months, if it can actually be salvaged and completed. Naval aircraft. As said, my strong suspicion is turboprop. However, I also have a strong suspicion that if the war goes on anything longer than 5 minutes, if it is historically as badly run by the French in their defence as it was, and Germany manages to get control of France,
I don't think in this scenario, even if war it doesn't begin, especially if war doesn't begin until September 1940, that Germany gets control of Norway. The reason being, the carriers and the whole forces are so much more developed, radar and aircraft wise, that things become even worse for the Germans. So if they do manage to get Norway, it's probably because Lord Corkenori is in charge still. But ideally he wouldn't be. Ideally someone sensible would be in charge. And there are potentials. But with also more rapid reaction strikes from bomber forces, etc., and things being able to be called upon, that is going to have an impact on things. It's going to have an impact on what's available, what's being done. And I think in terms of naval aircraft, I would reckon the jets would come into service. Probably you'd first get some experimenting going towards angled flight decks, and maybe the Implacables get ordered with angled flight decks. Maybe the audacious ones get ordered with. I think it's going to be a wild. It's going to come about, but it'll be developed as because it's one of those easy solutions to a complicated problem. Deck landing speed. How do we change this? And turboprop aircraft aren't going to be much higher than the aircraft that were coming in. It's going to be high enough. It's going to cause research and development, and then jet aircraft are going to be considered a problem beyond that. I would say jet aircraft, in terms of naval terms, would be navalized jet aircraft. Navalized as in taking things like the Vampire, if it's a whatever land-based aircraft, and converting it far more than the Seahawk idea. And converting it to a naval operational capability. It's actually more viable in some regards with things like the Vampire because of the way they are arranged to support their engines in terms of their airframe and their structuring, and the overbuilding that happens in early British jet aircraft. So leaving that all to one side, I think you could be talking about 1943 jet aircraft entering service in the fleet era. 42, 43. Now, that could be interesting. Honestly, I have to say, I've left the whole idea of does Japan get involved in this war out of it, because again, so many things could change. If the Americans are able to pick up and run with jet engines and gas turbines, and they probably will get to them, as said, I reckon they'll be allowed to start really, they'll be investing in developing it, but they'll be start implementing 1940 onwards with the way their government works. Japan could be honestly looking at a scenario where they are even more outnumbered and pushing to think of even more of an offset strategy, which might buy time on that kind of conflict. They also might be more selective about who they target. And they could be looking at it as having a distinct disadvantage versus both America and Britain at this point. It could also make German technology more attractive to them and make them more involved in getting into that scenario. It's a whole different layer of chess, and I would need to wargame that a lot to be in any way, shape or form satisfied with giving an answer. Because it's so far beyond scope. We'd be talking about something a decade and a half away from the starting point. In a scenario which might have gone very differently already because of the changes to the factors involved. Very differently already. And this is why it becomes kind of difficult to sort of talk through the effect on World War Two, because World War Two, I think, still happens. I'm sorry. These guys believe their own egos enough that they are, and drink their own Kool-Aid enough that I think World War Two is going to happen. They're going to make a mistake. They're going to think they can play a hand that they don't have and bluff their way through it. Too many times. They are bluffers. They're gamblers. They really are. And at a certain point, they will get called on that bluff. It happens to all dictators. If you look at the history of dictators and single person rules, where it's a rule of their single personality, it's always a bit of a bluff, because really no one person can run a country. No matter how much your ego might think you can do it, it's always a team effort. And at a certain point, you stop listening to your team because you've built up a group of people who are all yes people who are telling you what you want to hear, because otherwise they might lose their positions of power and influence and wealth and pleasure, or their lives even if they disagree with you, because you might be that kind of dictator. And you lose touch with reality very quickly, and you gamble too far, too fast, too hard, and you get called on it. If you ever play poker, you'll see this. There's usually a young player who's played a few games, maybe done quite well, maybe been lucky, and they start to believe they're really good. And they're getting very cocky, very very overly confident. Doesn't matter what their background is, almost all of them fall into this. That person is usually the easiest to make raise the stakes well beyond where it should be. Where everyone else is going, it's too rich for my blood. Gonna fall out of this. They will keep adding in more and more money because they're sure they're gonna win. They're sure they're the hot stuff. They're sure they're on a, they're hot. They're on a run. They're on a roll. Their luck's with them. You take their money. You don't need to do much. You just sit there being calm the whole time, looking like you don't have a care in the world. I think I went through that phase, but I used to play cards with my grandfather and other older male relatives quite a lot, so I probably went through that phase when I was about 7 or so. But I've seen it happen more often than I like to think about. And the thing is, I've seen it happen to more people around the world from more backgrounds than I like to think about. And it therefore makes me firm in my belief that it gets very worrying when you believe in your own hype. And almost the most damning insult in my vocabulary is, oh, you really have drunk your own Kool-Aid. Because it means you've lost touch with reality. You believe what you think. You believe everything about yourself. It's not true. So, yeah, I think World War II still happens. I think you have a fundamental problem, though, because Britain has fundamentally a better industrial base and a better research base than either of these two nations combined post-World War I, and has maintained that for more of the 1920s and 30s than them. And yeah, Britain has access to a lot of resources. I think when you combine in America and the rest of the wider, I wouldn't say alliance, but democratically co-aligned nations sharing interests, if not involvement. And the effect of that, yeah. World War II doesn't change in terms of results, but it might get a lot nastier. For them especially.
I'd say if the longer war holds off, the more of a problem it gets for them, because their economies are running hot to support their military spending, and they can't afford to run that hot for that long. Whereas if we consider most of the Western Allied economies, the co-aligned economies, they're not running hot. Britain's defence spending in 1939 is in no way going to break the bank. Germany's defence spending will. France's defence spending in 1939 is absolutely massively disorganised. But again, it's not going to break the bank, and it's nothing unusual for France. Italy's is almost as chaotic, and it will break the bank. And we're not going to get started on Japan. Summary. Well, first things first, this aircraft will not be as fondly remembered today as it is. It would probably have disappeared from history. It would be an interesting aircraft which served the Royal Navy in 1933 to 1936. Very good aircraft. And then it was replaced with an aircraft which built upon its success of stability, of ease of operation, of ease of flight, of ease of control, and was designed accordingly. And that would be what would replace it. That would be what would be in service. And maybe it would be the Mark II variant of that aircraft, which we would see in 1940 doing Taranto operations, or maybe it would be the next generation of turboprop aircraft. I don't know. It's going to depend how the turboprops develop in that time, how much more powerful they go, how quickly they grow more powerful. But let's be honest, turboprop engines can quickly grow up in power. It can very quickly break that 1,000 horsepower, very quickly break that 2,000 horsepower front. So that could be a useful scenario for the Royal Navy. That would turn on its head the Royal Navy's shortage of horsepower for its aircraft in the late 1930s. Overall, it's an interesting thing to think about, is that, with this and that, it's very plausible, considering the research base, considering the needs of the Royal Navy, considering how it would have fitted into Parsons and John Brown's research into efficient turbines and an efficient engine project. The idea of Whittle's research being combined with them, with a joint Admiralty Air Ministry project and support, makes a lot of sense and does perhaps in some cases make the case for the Ministry of Defence as a combined organisation. Because as separate organisations, this was allowed to happen. Whereas the combined organisation, perhaps it wouldn't have happened. The trouble is, it all depends on how that combined organisation works. Whether it maintains the best of the organisations it replaced, and harmonises and efficiency and makes them, harmonises them, and treats efficiency of delivery and efficiency of work as the aim, rather than efficiency in the pureness of just seeking to be the most efficient you can be, as some sort of godlike thing prophecy you're working towards. Let's be honest, as I said I think in the version that came out, Bilge Pumps, it was probably Drac, because I went Drac's version because that was far more eloquent than mine. Efficiency has become something which is almost pursued for efficiency's sake, to the point that we are now inefficient because we have no slack in systems. They are made so efficient that they cannot deal with any disruptions, and that actually means they are inefficient. That's the problem. And you really don't want governments to pursue that, because navies, armed forces, police, fire service, ambulance, hospitals, or education, all those things require slack in the system to deal with randomness. if a school suddenly has a fire, you don't want to have only just enough school space. You don't want to have only enough classrooms in a county to deal with for all the schools to be operating at maximum. You want there to be enough spaces across the county that if one of the schools has a fire or has some issue, you can send the kids to other schools with causing minimal disruption to their education while you fix that school. You know, these are things which are sensible, but they require you to spend money on it and explain to taxpayers, yes, we are paying for more than we currently need in terms of school places because it gives us insurance in case of emergencies. Which makes sense. But politicians don't like explaining those things, and that's off the topic. But it isn't really, because in the case of all of this, we've gone through, we've had the development, and at no point did I mention the possibility that some bright spark politician goes, well, for efficiency, let's put this all under the Air Ministry, or let's put this all under the Admiralty. It could go either way. With the tonnage limitations and the Admiralty is working for, and the options of engines for that, it could have been arguably put underneath the Admiralty, to give the Admiralty a sneaky edge, an advantage. That would also make the politicians' lives a little bit easier when they're making the case for treaties, because the Admiralty will feel they've got the advantage to play around in those treaties, which is useful. But it could also have been put under the Air Ministry, because after all, the guy who came up with it was an Air Force officer. I hope it wouldn't, because that would have just caused more trouble, and will mean one side would get prioritised over the other. Anyway. Thank you very much for watching. I haven't yet upgraded this to the Year of the Carrier list. That will be coming out soon. But this is technically coming out in 2023, and I do have a question to go over it, but I do also have a little bit of an announcement to make, because of course there's going to be a live. This is going to go out on Friday. There will be a live on Thursday night, which is tomorrow at my time, but yesterday when you're watching this. There is going to be a recorded video on Saturday, and then on Sunday there is going to be a live. It is going to end at 2300 hours, but there is going to be a New Year's Eve brew ships questions till the brew runs out. It'll be roughly 2300 hours when I'll go and enjoy my own family. I hope you'll enjoy. And the question for this video, and the question I'd like you to think about, is this. Looking at the Royal Navy as it is in this period, and looking at the other navies as they are, I've discussed a bit about the Royal Navy and what I think they do with the extra tonnage of getting gas turbines. Now, as said, I doubt the French get anywhere near it, and the Italians and Germans will try. I would love to hear what you think the Germans will actually do if they get the extra tonnage, how that will affect their designs. I think they make them even more complicated. But realistically, it's going to be the Americans. Japanese will probably try as well, but realistically, it's going to be the Americans. And how do you think these gas turbines would affect American designs that are going to be coming in that period? As said, I think they would be starting to get them from 1940 onwards. I think maybe the Iowa class, but I'd love to hear what you think about them and what you think they would get with gas turbines. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. And take care.